Hi everyone, this is Rohit from Lifestyle Mastery, and today I'm excited to have Seth Levine, who's a venture capitalist and a co-founder of Foundry VC, and Elizabeth MacBride, who's an international business journalist and founder of Times of Entrepreneurship. And together they have co-authored The New Builders, and now they've come up with a new book, Capital Evolution, where they explore how Americans' capitalism is shifting and why businesses and not government may hold the keys to building a more inclusive and prosperous future. Welcome to the show, Seth and Elizabeth.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Awesome. So, you've come on the podcast before. So it's been, I think, close to around 4 years now, and you've come up with a new book. Why the new book, and what gap do you think needs to be addressed and led you to write the second book now?
I think the reason that we enjoy working together. So that's one reason we decided to write a second book together.
That's a good lead, Elizabeth. I like that.
But we were also, after our first book was out, that gave us the opportunity to really travel around the country and speak to a lot of business leaders. And I think it widened our lens on what was happening in the American economy. And at the same time, both of us were noticing in our respective worlds, venture capital for Seth, and for me, Washington, D.C. and kind of think tanks and the thought leadership space. We were hearing a lot of people questioning whether capitalism had a future at all. And in some cases coming up with some crazy ideas for how capitalism could change or should change. And both of us thought those ideas were kind of not practical. So we set out to ask and interview business leaders across the country about what kind of practical solutions they could implement to make America work better for everyone.
I think that really, everyone listening, I'm sure recognizes that, the last, 10, 15 years have been fraught, right? No matter where on the globe that you're living. And I think we, Elizabeth and I, recognize that. And we started asking why. Why is society so polarized? Why are our politics, why have they become so fraught? And there's a bunch of different reasons for that, but ultimately it comes down to questions of how do we organize our society, who benefits, and what sort of economy have we created? And as we looked at the answer to those questions, what kind of economy have we created, we ultimately decided that while capitalism itself is really the best way to organize an economy, and we describe it more as like a political compact, like a political bargain between people, the government, people and each other, et cetera, more so than a sort of rigid economic system, because that is probably the best way to describe it. But the type of capitalism we've been practicing for the last, and I say we, I mean really the whole world to some extent, certainly in the US, maybe the most extreme example of it, over the last 50 years has not served us well, right? It's produced this inequality in our system. It's produced subpar growth relative to what it could have or should have been, certainly to what it was in prior eras that had a different flavor of capitalism. But at the same time, it felt like it was worth defending. And so rather than throwing it out, and there's a lot of discussion now about, especially amongst younger people, about capitalism being sort of irredeemably flawed, our thought was capitalism as a system is quite dynamic and can work in different forms in different ways. Why don't we explore the ways in which it could work a little bit better, restore dynamism to the economy, create a greater ownership class across economies, and provide more opportunity for more people. And so rather than sort of take this populist, sort of political divisions and sort of foster them and almost egg them on, which I think a lot of people are doing now, we wanted to provide sort of a view into why did we and how did we get to where we are, and what do we do about it? Where do we go from here? And so that was really the impetus for the book itself. So I think that everyone listening to this podcast recognizes that we're in a time of division, a time of change. Elizabeth and I recognize that as well. And rather than sort of egg on the political divisions and the economic divisions that we saw, we asked ourselves, how did we get here? Why did we get here? And that led us to start exploring sort of how our economies, really global economies, but in the U.S., since we're both U.S. based, how did the U.S. economy get organized in the way that it did? How did it used to be organized? And what we discovered is that actually capitalism is relatively dynamic and it changes over time. The last 50 years have been marked by something that we call neoliberal capitalism, sort of Friedman economics after Milton Friedman. And our belief is that that's been harmful to both the overall growth of the world and the U.S. economy, certainly to the divisions that we've seen in our societies and inequality that we see in our society. But it doesn't have to be there and it be that way, and it hasn't always been that way. And so we wanted to uncover that. And one of the things that we in particular wanted to address was that that capitalism itself is not to blame, right? It is not. Maybe it's the Winston Churchill quote, it's the worst form of organizing an economy except for all the others. I mean, it really is responsible for lifting billions of people out of poverty over the last millennia, let's say. And that's incredibly powerful, but it doesn't mean that it shouldn't be changed. And so we wanted to take a thorough look at where we came from and talk about where we might go. We outline a future for really the global economy, but for the U.S. economy especially. We call it dynamic capitalism, and it recognizes that it doesn't have to be the way that it always has been. But it talks a lot about sort of the balance of power. It talks about how to manage an economy in an age when trust in media, certainly trust in the government, is at all-time lows. And it talks very specifically about the role of businesses, the role of business leaders in our economy. They're increasing in power. And we did that through storytelling, through interviewing a lot of not just CEOs like Jamie Dimon and Dick Parsons and Dan Schulman, but also sort of people across the sort of the value chain into business, right? Workers, people that work on the shop floor, et cetera. And try to tell their stories and you weave that into a narrative around where the economy both came from and where it's going.
Got it. Interesting. And the subtitle is about how business has overtaken American democracy. But how did that transition actually unfold over the last 50 years? And where do you see in the next 10, 15 years, how's business going to overtake American democracy in your view?
Well, I mean, there are two key things to understand about neoliberalism or Milton Friedman-based capitalism, right, which came about in the mid-1970s. And those two elements are Milton Friedman really outlined a world where shareholders were the most important figures in his economic view, right? For businesses, for companies that are the heart of capitalism, their job was to increase returns for their shareholders. And Milton Friedman thought that was really the only ethical way for companies to run themselves. So they shouldn't be worried about their communities. They shouldn't worry about externalities like pollution, or they shouldn't worry about it very much. His views are actually a little bit more nuanced than people give him credit for. But that's one key thing to understand about neoliberalism, right? We developed a system of laws, policies, and norms that really hamstring companies based on the idea that their primary responsibility is to shareholders. So that's the first thing that developed in the 1970s, and the business community embraced it. And then the second thing to understand about neoliberalism is that when Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher both rose to power, respectively, in the United States and the UK, they, for political reasons, reformulated kind of our narrative system to turn government into the enemy. And they did that for political reasons, right? It's always very handy to have an enemy if you're a politician. And so when that happened, those two things together resulted over the long term in the long decline of government as an ideal in our society, as an actual active force in our society. And then at the same time, businesses were rising in power. And a lot of this happened to some extent off the radar because the media has always reported more effectively, at least since World War II. The media has always reported more about the government. It's just easier for a lot of journalists. And so they were paying attention to the government and not necessarily the rise of business.
Got it. And you've argued that, decades of prioritizing shareholder value above wealth have created, this fractured economy. So what are the biggest consequences of that mindset, especially in a capitalist world like US?
Yeah, I mean, I think the danger of a shareholder only viewpoint to the world is that you treat everything as a resource to be extracted. And absolutely, and we trace the history of this over the last, say, 50 years. Milton Friedman, famously put out he wrote a book about it before this, but he put out a sort of a summary of his book in the New York Times in 1970. And, sort of essentially since that time, we've operated sort of as a Friedman style economy, right? Whether you're in the U.S., whether you're a Democrat or Republican, famously when Friedman died, a number of like high profile Democrats sort of said something to the effect of, we're all Friedmanites now. And that was Larry Summers, probably most famously, but there were a number of them. And Larry Summers was the Treasury Secretary under President Clinton. And so that was just how we organized our economy. And the problem is that everything then becomes something to be optimized, right? And something to be extracted from. And so that included workers, certainly included the middle class. As from a consumer perspective, we piled debt on consumers in order to have them continue to buy the goods and services that were being produced by not just the U.S. economy, but the global economy. And of course, the environment, right, which was a resource also to be extracted. And that's just simply not sustainable in really even the medium term, but certainly in the long term. And it drove, from our perspective, sort of perversions in our economy that have led to this inequality. And if you look at sort of the growth in wages and the growth of wealth, most of the growth in both of those categories has gone to people who are already were the wealthiest in our society. And so we've become a bit more unbalanced. Now, it is true that some of the people who were the poorest in our society have moved into the middle class. That's largely because in the US, we've restructured the tax system to advantage people at the very, very low end. And I say advantage, I mean, just give them a little bit of a help. Earned income child tax credit, things like that. And so that has moved people out of sort of the poverty, the lowest income tiers, into the middle tiers. But we've not done as good a job moving people from the middle tier into the upper tier. And in fact, dynamism, which is a sort of a broad term that describes sort of all sorts of positive things in the economy, but the ability for people to move out of one social class into another one has gone down significantly. 50 years ago, if you were born in the bottom 25% of the wealth scale in the US, you had about a 25% chance of ending your life in the top 25%. There was a decent amount of economic mobility. Today, you have about a 5% chance of doing that. And that's because we've moved away from this meritocracy. And I think both Elizabeth and I are very much fans of a meritocratic society. We want people, it's not that everyone should be equal. People are born with different traits, different abilities, different work ethics, all of those things, right? There's nothing wrong with that, and we should acknowledge that. We're not trying to create an equal society. We're trying to create a society that allows those people who, through their own grit and determination and access to education, et cetera, are able to lift themselves up. But we've moved away from that as a society for a whole bunch of different reasons that we can talk about, as we get into it. And we think that that's bad for our economy and it's bad for our society.
And if I can just jump in, because this is one of my, I've been just thinking about this and it drives me a little bit crazy, but I feel like in the kind of media think tank space, there are all these people who, when they recognize that our meritocracy wasn't working, they came out with books and podcasts and articles saying, focused on the fact that meritocracy was an illusion, right? And there wasn't really a middle of the road or a normal person or a reasonable person discussion that said, okay, meritocracy is actually a great idea, right? Maybe we'll never do it perfectly, but let's talk about how we can restore elements of it and make it work again in the United States. And it was an example on meritocracy, it's an example of the way our conversation just really puts people at the extremes, right? And there's no real attempt to be in the middle because everyone is trying to be extreme and craft a brand in the media.
It's a really interesting thread to pull too, Elizabeth, when you think about it, because if you think about sort of some of the divisions, certainly, well, I think globally, but especially apparent in the U.S. society, and some of the things people argue about, a lot of them relate to sort of who gets help, right, in our society, and who is benefited. And there's extreme views now on either side, right, which is that any on one side of the political aisle, it's any benefit to any person for any reason isn't correct, right? And that's not meritocratic, right? And then the other side, it's, hey, there's, hundreds of years of systemic racism and other things that have caused, these whole groups of people to not have opportunity. And those people should be massively advantaged, right? And the language can be extreme on either side. And of course, like most things in the book, kind of describes a lot of the, not this specific example, but describes a lot of things as like, the answer ends up being in the messy middle, but it's messy because you have to address both that there have been things that we've done in our economy for hundreds of years that have disadvantaged people, and that everyone deserves a real chance, right? And I think you see it in the debates around and the polarization and the weaponization of terms like DEI. You certainly see it in sort of the admissions and affirmative action debates that are taking place in the U.S. Ultimately, they boil down to that question, right? What is meritocratic and what's fair, right? And I think that it's interesting to think about that as a framework for what's going on in our society. And I think ultimately people want to get back to something that seems meritocratic, right? They don't want the 5% chance of getting into the top, wealth spheres. They want the 25% chance or more. But they have different views as to why we are where we are, and they get very extreme, I think, in how they describe it. And so, part of what we're trying to do in this book is maybe chart out a middle path that recognizes that there are challenges in our society that we should address in different ways, but also recognizes that extreme ways of thinking about those issues are not likely to lead to outcomes that are widely popular and accepted.
Right. Interesting. You made a point. As you know, I'm Indian, but India and China's GDP was pretty similar 30 years back. And the last 30 years, they're now almost like an economic rival to US. But do you think China is an ideal state, and should US try to copy what China is doing? Or do you think the cultures are too different, the thinking patterns are too different, and what's the middle way? What's the right way? Where US should lead in the next 10, 20 years.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things about China is that there are a lot of Americans making pronouncements about what China is. And really, I don't think many Americans know. Hopefully, there are some experts out there who understand it more. I do think it's a different culture from the American culture, and it's really hard for us to make sweeping generalizations about it. But I think it's entirely right to say that what works for China is not very likely to work in the United States because it's such a different culture. That's one thing. And then there are also, I believe there are absolute truths in the world, right? I do not believe in government surveillance of the level that seems to be ratcheting up in the United States, whether that exists or not in China. You hear it does. I don't know whether it does. The idea of crony capitalism, and that you have to know somebody to start a business, or that you're born into, that you have to know somebody to start a business, that the money all flows through those government connections. I don't agree with that as right at all, whether it's in China or the United States. And so, yeah, I think that's the answer, right? I do not believe that it's a correct policy move for the US to be looking to China for a guide for how to organize our economy. What we should be doing is looking inside our own country and deciding what our values are, and then working with each other to create that new reality.
And very specifically, because it's worth calling out, we wrote an entire op-ed that was published in the New York Times in September about this. That Trump is copying some aspects of the Chinese economy and crony capitalism, right? And I think that we think that that's a mistake. It's specifically the way in which he's extracting essentially political favors from companies doing business in the way that they want to do business, right? So there are a couple of examples, right? He approved the Nippon Steel merger, but only with the U.S. getting a golden share, essentially a whole bunch of power to control what the business does. Probably even more importantly than that, Intel and NVIDIA wanted to sell chips in China, and so he extracted essentially a 15% rev share for that, and then ultimately took 10% of Intel, a 10% stake of Intel, through a program that had supported dozens of companies, right? So I don't know why Intel was singled out for that. And this sort of ownership idea was not part of the program that had been approved. In fact, the money was already spent. It was an attempt to get U.S. chip manufacturers to be building fabs here in the U.S. Might be good policy. I'm not debating that. We're not even debating the idea that the U.S. might dole out money or tax breaks or whatever in exchange for some sort of ownership or warrant or something that provides U.S. taxpayers with a return. It's just, it can't be done on an ad hoc basis for random companies that Trump either likes or doesn't like. And I think that, and we see it in tariffs as well, right? You want to get an exemption to some tariff that he's proclaimed. You go to Washington and you offer him some favor. You donate to to his library, you buy his crypto meme coin thing, right? Which is directly just giving money into his pocket. Like that kind of crony capitalism ultimately tears down a society. And you've seen this in China, right? One of the things we point out in that op-ed is the rates of entrepreneurship, people starting businesses in China, has gone way down, right? Significantly down. Obviously, the Chinese government, I should point out, disputes these figures, but it was essentially the Chinese government that put the figures out in the first place. And the reason that that's happening is because you need to know someone. You always kind of needed to know someone in China, but now you really need to be currying political favor in order to start a business. And long term, that's not good for society. It's not good for China. It's certainly not good in the U.S. And I think that our belief is that, as Elizabeth said, we should organize our economy based on our societal values. And ultimately free markets and the free movement of people, labor, and capital, and that is, I think, a strong argument that most classic conservatives would agree with. I'm not sure how we got away from that in the Trump administration to one that looks much more like a favoritism-based economy, but I think we do that at our peril.
And I was just wondering, do you think is there any country in the Western world which is doing a good job in, running a democratic government based on meritocracy and making all the right moves? Is there an ideal state in your view?
That's a good question. Well, how is India doing? Can I turn it back to you and that question? Yeah.
Yeah, I think we got those tariffs imposed by Trump, and I think he needs a Nobel Prize for that. But I think in the last 20-25 years, I think India has been stable, and I think that's a good thing. But we have our own problems. We're not growing as fast as China did in the last 20-30 years, and even though we're the world's biggest democracy, we're pretty dependent on Russia and for oil and a few other things. But yeah, I mean, but we're made to believe that US is doing a great job, and that's. But I was wondering, outside of US and Europe, do you find any other country who you think would be doing a good job.
The reason it's
10
such
good
a
years?
hard question to answer, and the answer, which may be counterintuitive based on sort of how we've been describing things, right? Historically, it has been the U.S., right? I mean, certainly the U.S.
Yeah.
economy has been the growth engine for the world and has been growing faster, exempting China because of the actual growth rates were higher in China and India for that matter, but you were growing from a different base. But in terms of sort of overall standards of living, et cetera, in the US, like very high, we've done a really good job. What we're arguing is one, it's not sustainable and it has led to this fracture in our society. So it's not that we've been perfect, but far from it. But that we should have and can in the future do a better job. It's hard to compare economies because there are different tolerances for levels of government spending in different economies. There's different levels of sort of people from different backgrounds, right? I mean, there are some Scandinavian economies that have done nicely, but they're very homogenous societies, right? And you have different challenges when you bring people together from lots of different places. I think that's a benefit and ultimately increases dynamism in the U.S. economy. I know Elizabeth does as well. But it also creates some challenges, right? Some of which we see in terms of U.S. immigration policy right now and the like. And so it's really hard to compare sort of one ideal over the other. And really, it's a question of comparing the ideal American economy to the actual American economy, right? Or the ideal UK economy to the actual UK economy. And I think that that's in part what we're trying to do here. And in part, sort of raising the alarm, raising the flag and saying, hey, yes, the US economy, if you look, at the economy as a whole, has done quite well. But you need to look past that and recognize which pieces of our economy haven't done well and why that's unsustainable. There's an old joke about Jeff Bezos walking into a pub with 100 people in it, and the average person in that pub is a billionaire. And that doesn't help you say anything about what's actually going on, because obviously Bezos is worth whatever, $200 billion, and everyone else is worth whatever they're worth, but much less than $1 billion. And we've done that a little bit in the U.S. economy. And we do that in general, right? We look at aggregate statistics. And what we do in the book is say, we need to look past that and understand what's really happening. And again, part of it stems from questions around why are we polarized? Well, part of why we're polarized is because we're polarized economically as well. And so we talk about that.
Got it. And you've introduced the idea of dynamic capitalism. So what does it mean in practice, and how does it differ from, the prevailing model right now?
Seth, you want to take that one because you've been working on the art?
Yeah, we've been working on how we want to describe it succinctly. So let me run through it, and you can give us some feedback on it actually, because it's a term we use in the book, but we never actually in the book offer the type of definition I'm about to offer. We describe it in a bunch of different ways, much more richly and contextually. But ultimately, dynamic capitalism recognizes that the form of capitalism that we've practiced over the last 50 years has led to what we've talked about, the unsustainable fissures in our economy and society. It treats too many things, the environment, the middle class, workers more generally, as resources to be extracted from. And the result has been rising inequality, increasing political instability. And they're both, to some extent, natural outgrowths from the kind of economic setup that we've been operating under, specifically neoliberal capitalism and Friedman's view on shareholder primacy. And at the same time, all of this is happening. Our trust in government, our trust in media have both declined, and that's risen to a rise in the power and influence of businesses, and specifically businesses and their leaders. And dynamic capitalism sees a different path. Right. We believe that capitalism is the most effective system for organizing an economy, for driving growth, for pulling people out of poverty, as we've discussed that it's done. But we also recognize that capitalism needs to adapt. It needs to recognize other stakeholders than just shareholders, and it needs to provide more opportunities for ownership and more opportunities for economic mobility and merit, and ultimately meritocracy in our economy.
Let me take a stab at maybe identifying the three elements that we believe four elements that have to be part of dynamic capitalism. One is that the government is not in charge of investment, right? Is not in charge of apportioning of deciding the winners and losers in a society. And that's why Seth and I stepped up and wrote that op-ed in the New York Times, because you really cannot have a free market system when the government is intervening at that level of the economy. So free markets. We also believe that the rise of technology and the decline in the number of jobs being produced by companies is going to require different ways for people to participate in the system, not just as employees, but as owners. And we give a lot of examples in the book of different models of employee ownership. So that's another point. A third point is that you have to have a rule of law. And it's a terrible fact that in this current world, we're discussing that, right? It has to be a rule of law that applies to everyone and not just the wealthy. They are not the only, and it's not also just they're right. Laws also apply to immigrants, or they apply to undocumented people, right? We have a system of laws that works for everybody. And then the final idea, I think we've already referred to it a couple of times, is meritocracy, right? We need to have, it's never going to be perfect, but we need to have a system whereby people get a fair shot at rising. And that is also an element of dynamic capitalism.
Got it. Interesting. And you had interviewed, a lot of CEOs, academics, and politicians. Were there any stories from workers or entrepreneurs that stood out as particularly powerful when you doing that research?
You want to talk about Optimax?
Yes, because Optimax is a great one. I should say we interviewed so many interesting business leaders, Jamie Dimon, Kenichi Hori, who's from Japan. And I learned so much from talking with them. But Optimax is a company, technically a small business, although I think it has about 200 employees in Rochester, New York, in the United States. And Optimax is a company that was founded by two, what we would call blue collar workers. In other words, they were line workers at Kodak, the old photography powerhouse that America produced about 100 years ago. And these two blue collar workers had a great idea. Kodak didn't want to invest in it. And so they decided, we're going to go off and start our own company. And they did that. Rich is the CEO, there are two CEOs, two founders. We interviewed him. And they started the company, and it has been a smashing success. They produce optics for NASA and for other leading kind of edge uses. And at a certain point, these two guys decided that they didn't want to sell the company and become billionaires. They didn't want to just keep enriching themselves. And so what they decided to do was turn the company into an employee-owned model. And they used a particular, and so they structured the company in very smart ways so that the profits are distributed to the employees. But they also took a number of steps to keep the kind of incentive structure in place so that the company would still be responding to market forces, that the employees had some control, but not entire control. It has a nonprofit board. And through that, they've distributed, I think, $500 million to their community of Rochester, New York, which is through these employee bonuses and through the profits that are produced at the company. And we think that's a model that more business leaders should be looking at if they want to take part in this new conversation about dynamic capitalism, about how to rebuild a more fair American economy.
Got it. And obviously, I want to talk about AI, where, a lot of people are saying that you'll have a one-person company which is doing around $100 million. But do you think that is going to lead to a lot more unbalance? And do you think governments are ready where, a lot of CEOs are saying that humans are going to be replaced with AI agents and humans won't be required? Do you think like a concept of universal income, is going to be there in next or 10, 20 years, and are governments thinking about it or not?
Yeah, we talk about it in the book. Seth, do you want to take that one? We actually had a debate about whether we should include it in the book, and I pressed to include universal basic income in the book. So Seth thought it was
at least acknowledging that that's something that that people are
Right.
talking about. I guess what I would say, I a couple things, right? I mean, I think that it is easy at the beginning of a new technology wave to be a doomsayer, right? And we sometimes forget. I mean, we're surrounded by technology, right? I mean, our phones, our computers, but even things like cars. Each of these things was new, right? And each of these things felt disruptive. Cars is a great example. Reid Hoffman uses this in his new book. But when cars were introduced, they were so scary. People were so afraid of this new technology that you had to actually have someone walking in front of the car to sort of warn people that there was a car there, right? So obviously it was no better than walking essentially because you couldn't move faster and whatever. Now we don't think about it, right? Where we drive all over the place and it's not a scary technology because we're used to it. Um, and so I use that as an example, not to say that there won't be disruption from AI, right? If you were a farrier, let's say, you hooved, horses or something like that, or you were a groomsman and you took care of horses, like the car revolution was very disruptive. But it also created all sorts of jobs that we probably never thought of, right? In terms of, mechanics and drivers and whatever, things like that. Um, and and so I can understand why AI seems very transformative and scary, but I'm not ready personally to make broad proclamations that, the need for human work will go away in 5 years or whatever the thing that people might be saying. And I guess I'd just take a more measured view to it. I think that AI will be a boon to productivity. I think it will be very disruptive in the sense that individuals will have their jobs disrupted, right? Different than the last disruption, which was the manufacturing automation disruption. People like to talk about in the US about manufacturing leaving the US. That's not what happened, right? I mean, some manufacturing, yes, did leave the US, but we manufacture more today onshore than we ever have. We just don't use a lot of humans to do it, right? Manufacturing jobs change significantly. And so, I think that AI will have similar impacts. We should probably learn from what happened in manufacturing. We talk about that in the book, and we describe sort of why we kind of had our eyes closed to that and what happened because of that. And so I think we should have our eyes wide open to that. UBI, Universal Basic Income, might be a piece of that debate. I have mixed views on it myself at the moment, but I'm open to, and I think most people are just sort of defaulting to it because it's sort of like, okay, if things get really bad and there are no jobs, then we'll figure out a way to pay people. Like, I mean, I think it's an easy way to sort of try to allay fears, but I don't know how. And there are real arguments in favor of UBI. I've read quite a bit about it.
I think I think we should just if I think we should need to recognize that we already have universal basic income and a lot of places do because Social Security is basically right. Retirement schemes
Yeah.
are basically universal basic income. So that's not a particular scary concept to think about how we can implement that. And we also had, if you think of during the pandemic, a form of universal basic income when we started sending checks to people. And what did they do with that? They actually started businesses. So I don't think that's not a scary concept either, right? One of the things we do in our book, one of the reasons my partnership with Seth works is that we put everything on the table. There shouldn't be things that we cannot see through a lens of consensus building and coalition building. AI is like that. Universal basic income is like that. We need to be able to talk about these things and be constantly widening the frame to understand that they're not taboo. Talking about Trump's is not taboo either, right? So
Yeah, and one of the things, and you're getting a glimpse into it right now, like one of the things that was great about our writing partnership is we can have these debates, right? We have different views, although I would say mine is very much forming on UBI. But no, you're absolutely right, Elizabeth. Like there's some forms of government support exist everywhere, right? And one of the things people like and don't like about UBI is there's no strings attached, right? So it's the bureaucratic state perhaps can be lessened, and maybe we shift some existing social programs to look more like these UBI style programs that are again, less strings attached. I think people have different views about that. We've certainly seen that more recently in the U.S. as we pass some policies around Social Security and Medicare. But it's interesting to think about. But to your main point, it's like, how scared of AI should we be? At the moment, I see promise in AI. And, I mean, I think that I run the risk of being a techno optimist. Obviously, I'm in the tech industry. I see the ways in which AI is positively impacting my own personal world, and the world of the companies that I work with, meaning making them more efficient. But I also see the data that suggests that young people are having more trouble finding jobs because entry-level jobs are more likely to be done by agents and things like that. And I think we're going to have to continue to have a conversation and reckoning about what does AI really mean as it gets developed. But we are early inning. Whatever analogy you want to use, we are barely scratching the surface in terms of what AI will ultimately become.
I think business leaders really need to establish lines of communication across their companies so that the bad aspects of AI also get filtered up. Right. We're in a moment of the new technology where people are afraid of it. We're also in a moment where leaders who stand to benefit the most from it in terms of increased productivity or increased wealth, we're in a moment where they can embrace it too hard. And so if people at the lower levels of a company are afraid to talk about the risks of AI or the bad implications or the practices that are not working, that could potentially be a disaster for a company and for all of us if we go off the rails with AI.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And you suggested government effectiveness is declining while businesses should shoulder more responsibility. So what do you think should be a realistic reform you like to see government to restore that sort of balance, where government is also as effective, and have that responsibility?
Yeah,
I would love to just completely remake government. That would be, it's hard to answer the question because you got to start with where we are, and where we are is not in a really sustainable place, including, in the US, we can't keep driving budget deficits in the way that we do, right? So there's this dual prong challenge of on the one hand, as Elizabeth traced the history of, back to Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, there's been this sort of constant drumbeat of government bad. But on the other hand, we've actually increased the size of government massively, right? And so, the unfortunate thing is that has meant that government has been more sort of intrusive in our lives in lots of different ways. And yet people are also being told constantly that government is evil. And neither of those two things is good. So, ultimately, we need smaller government, and that needs to include how we think about in the U.S. military spending in particular. And so that needs to happen. We cannot sustain. Something like 50% of the U.S. workforce either works for the government or is government adjacent, meaning they're working for private companies that are doing work for the government. That's just too much. It's completely unsustainable, and that transition is going to be really hard. And at the same time, we need to make choices around what things we want to support. And I think that's the challenge. Politicians struggle with that, which is why we can't seem to ever pass a budget bill that doesn't increase the deficit.
Yeah, I think there's two things that I just add to that, which are this is why we spend a whole chapter in the book talking about the ownership economy. One reason that we've had this growth in government and government adjacent jobs is that we haven't grappled with the fact that the private sector needs fewer jobs because of technology. And so we need to restructure the legal system and the way that companies work so that you can that you have money flowing along different paths other than employment. So that's one thing. And we spent a chapter on that in the book. But the other thing I would say is that I spent the first 3 months of this year reading Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, which is something that the Trump base likes to refer to a lot. Then I went out to lunch with somebody who was a Trump voter, and it turned out he had read the abridged version. And I was very, but it's very interesting to study what happens. And I think one of the key turning points in the decline of any country is when too much power is residing in one person. And so if I'm talking about restoring a balance, right? We have a great system for balance in the United States, and it is judicial, executive, and legislative. And so restoring that balance or coming up with something equally as powerful to restrain the power of an executive is what we need to focus on.
Right. And somebody was listening to the podcast and you're speaking directly to a founder or a very young entrepreneur. What advice would you give to them to thrive in this new era of capitalism where things are changing so much?
There's a couple things that we say. We say it in the book. Like one is to open your aperture a little bit, right? I mean, if people more and more are spending time both online and offline in spaces where it's only with people that they agree with, and I think that it can be hard sometimes to expose yourself to ideas that are contrary to sort of what you think about. But that can be through podcasts, can be through reading, it can be ideally through actual interactions and talking to people. And I think that's probably the most important thing. And I think it's become increasingly hard as our social circles have narrowed and we spend time more and more with people that agree with us. That's probably the number one thing. I say this to my kids both of our kids are kind of like late teens, early 20s, Elizabeth and mine. And I say this to my kids all the time, like, how do you get it? And I send them things sometimes and they're just like, what is this? And I'm like, well, but I thought it was thought provoking. I don't have to agree with everything. Right now I'm reading Ben Shapiro's book, Lions and Scavengers. Fascinating. Ben Shapiro and I don't agree on a lot of stuff. But I found it helpful. I hadn't read his other books. I read it because I heard it on a bunch of podcasts, by the way, including Ezra Klein. I thought they had a really interesting debate because they obviously have different political views and things like that. But also Coleman Hughes, who has a great podcast that Ben was on. And after I heard him a couple times, I was like, this guy's really smart. I mean, I knew who he was. I heard him from time to time on things. I was like, I'm gonna dig into that. That seems worth paying attention to. And so I think the more people can do that, I think the better. And of course, the other advice I'm giving to, especially to younger people, is lean into AI, right? I mean, there was a moment when like my kids' schools were like, oh, no one can use AI. It's cheating or whatever. And I actually wrote to some of the administrators and was like, you are not preparing our kids to be citizens in the next 10 years if you are telling them they should be scared of or not use AI. And so I've been really trying to push my children to be experts in AI and really be thoughtful about how they use it. And so, I don't know how well that's working yet. We'll see. And of course, as I said, AI is very, very early. But those are some things that come to my mind. What else do you have?
I mean, we suggest in the book that since we're in this space where government is doing less, and businesses are called upon to do more, that you should have a very clear sense of your own values, not get pulled into too many political conversations, not get overstretched into this role of being a society builder or weighing in on the politics. But you do need to know your values. You need to know what your employees actually support and want. And you do need to recognize that you may have to take a stand and just be firm on it. Don't take too many, but you might be called on to do that, because that's the role that businesses are playing in this new global society.
Correct. And it looks like, the book is going to come out, and where can people find the book, and when are you looking to launch it?
It
Release
launches
date is December 9th. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
No. Well, it launches December 9th. And Seth, you give the call to action.
Yeah, so you can buy the book anywhere that you like to buy books: Amazon, Barnes and Noble, Books A Million, your local bookstore, etc. Or you can go to thecapitalevolution.com and you can find both more information about the book, as well as speaking opportunities for Elizabeth and for me based on the topics that we talk about in the book. And then we have some links to various places where you can purchase the book as well.
Got it. And I quickly want to do the top three. What's your favorite business book? Either of you can go.
Wow. Okay, my favorite business book. Oh, I'd have to say one of Peter Drucker's.
Okay.
This may not be thought of as a business book, but I really, as I think about how I organize my life and time, essentialism.
Oh, okay. Got it.
That or Subtract by Lodi Katz. I think about those two in the context of business. I think about those two all the time.
Oh, nice. Got it. And if you could go back in time when you're writing the book, uh, Capital Evolution, what is the one thing you would have focused on or done things differently?
Oh, that one's easy for me because I wish we had had time to write a whole chapter on the information environment um, and how that plays into currently what's happening. Information is one of the essential, accurate information is one of the essential ingredients in free markets. And so we need to make sure people recognize that.
Well, I love that. I was going to say I would have bought more Bitcoin, but I mean, I'm joking, but I'm not. I wish I had.
We both have some of that, by the way. We both have some
Yeah,
of
there
that.
you go. We got to hedge a little bit, right? You never know what's going to happen in society.
Yes.
I I loved the process of writing the book. I really, really enjoyed it. The only thing I think, if I could just have waved a magic wand, I really enjoy when Elizabeth and I are in the same place writing together. She lives in DC, I live in Colorado, and so we do most of our writing asynchronously. Although we sometimes have a Zoom open for 10 hours where we're both working. But we get together a couple of times, sort of in each book process, and write sort of spread out at a big table and write together. And I would have loved to if we'd had a chance. And we both have busy lives and kids and things like that. But if we could have done that a couple more times, I thought that was some of my most enjoyable writing experiences when we got to write essentially side by side.
Yeah,
Got it. Interesting.
if you buy, and people who buy, I think it's 200 copies of the book, and we are getting orders of that size, which is very exciting.
Oh, nice.
So if you buy that many copies, we're working on a recorded interview between me and Seth where we discuss efficiency and how to work with a tornado. That's my favorite way to describe Seth, which is working with Seth is like being in a small room with a tornado. So,
I take that as a compliment.
it is a
Elizabeth
compliment.
insists it's a compliment, but yeah, no, my brain doesn't quiet down very often, so there's a lot going on up here.
Yeah, but I think, so buy a bunch of copies of the book, and then we will send you what I think will be a very valuable series of tips and tricks for getting a lot done.
And an amusing interview. More information and our contact information is on thecapitalevolution.com on our website. And so you can, if any of your listeners are interested in a larger order, we'll be doing those really, throughout the book selling process. So well into 2026, they can find more information at thecapitalevolution.com.
Got it. We'll put down in the show notes. And just one last thing. Well, what's your favorite business tool? For example, Gmail, Slack, Zoom, ChatGPT.
I mean, my favorite is, I'm sorry, I'm just going to be old school and say pen and paper. I have them with me 24/7, and I use them all the time.
We're going to bookend this because my favorite is an AI platform called Blocks, BLOKS. And it essentially is like my virtual assistant. It travels around with me. It listens in on my calls and it shadows my inbox. And so it knows everything that's going on. I can then use it to ask questions about a person, a company, et cetera. And it knows all of my interactions with them from emails to calendar events. And if we did a Zoom or if I recorded a meeting on my laptop, it's got all of the information about that. And it also allows me to very quickly send summaries of a meeting, let's say, to my business partners if they missed a meeting or I needed to let them know about something. So it's kind of my central repository for data. I also, by the way, carry around a notebook too. So it's, those two things aren't necessarily, they don't necessarily rule each other out.
Got it. So it's called blocks.app, is it? And that's
it's blocks.ai, BLOKS.
.ai. Okay, got it.
We're not investors, by the way. I met the founder, and
Nice.
it's very similar to Granola, which is a platform that a lot of people use to record meetings, and that's another way to
Right.
do this. But it pulls things in from lots of other places, which I find really powerful.
Interesting. I'll have a look and put that in the show notes. And what's the best way people can reach out to you? And if they want to buy the book, it's on capitalevolution.com.
The Capital
Yeah.
Evolution.
Got it. We'll put it in the show notes. Seth and Elizabeth, thank you so much for taking our time and speaking to us. I really enjoyed my conversation with you.
Thank
We
you.
loved it as well. Thank you.
Thanks.